All right, so if you just punch in keto sunburn resistance, so I had noticed the sunburn resistance. I had already read, as I mentioned, the omega 6 and omega 3. So right away when I started, noticing the sunburn resistance, I was like, you know what? I bet you it has to do with the avoidance of the omega 6 and me going after a lot of the omega 3 sources. So when I saw here, let's say, look on the top, resistance to sunburn on keto, show me the science. For sure, we're making claims about this and people are like, yeah, right, yeah, sure. Oh, it heals everything. Let's keep in mind that my point of view, my opinion is that we were hunters and gatherers. We were largely hunters and took advantage of gathering certain plant matters that over time we learned how to process through crushing, grinding, soaking, uh, and sprouting and fermenting. These are the plant products that were incorporated into a lot of people, a lot of cultures. So they were rarely eating the kinds of fruits and vegetables which currently are all genetically modified, way different, way different plants than what our ancestors were eating. So just wanted to show you that it's not all in my head, it must be in a lot of people's head. And this is what we call anecdotal evidence. So large amounts of people, and we could say that the keto and carnivore, we're a community, we're kind of a modern tribe here that are all connected together and beginning to share our own experiences. And this is how it occurred in earlier times. We bind it together, we shared our common experiences, and we began to see patterns. We began to be able to decipher through what we craved, through how we feel. And if the ketogenic diet is making us lose weight, it's reversing insulin resistance. It's making us allowed to, it's giving us the ability to be in the sun all day, to absorb that vitamin D3. Our appetites become under control, our depression is improved, hypertension is reversed. People are saying, yeah, right, this is snake oils, yeah, sure, this solves all the problems. Yeah, right. And unfortunately, science is putting closing their eyes to this because they don't want us to know this. They want to encourage us to eat what makes money, which is the seed oils, even though there's evidence that it could be a driver for coronary vascular disease, lead to violence, lead to inflammation, leads to cancers. But that's okay, right? So here's the keto carnivore diet. So maybe it's a cure-all for everything, since it's no one's in denial. Everybody knows that these modern diseases are categorized as modern diseases because they weren't occurring at all or at this insane level. So there are lifestyles in the modern era. Now I know that even the synthetic foods that we're consuming, the junk foods, all of that, yes, no one's debating that that's an issue, but humans are being convinced to eat margarine, even though there is scientific evidence. We put a lot of faith in science and say, well, they would never do that to us. Unfortunately, it's the case, because it's not only is science, not investigating these areas, they are investigating these areas, but if it doesn't fit the narrative of saturated fat, cholesterol, and sodium, then some of these papers aren't even being published. And when they find out, sometimes decades later, why didn't you publish it? They say, because we didn't come to the conclusion that we had hoped, which is very dishonest. Science is supposed to, be objective, not hold any biases, and, print the results, not, structure studies to to get the best chance of getting the results that you really believe. So sun exposure, this is a ketogenic diet. So just wanted to show you, here's an example. Let's go to the next slide. That's this one. Let's close that one. Go to this one here. Dietary polyunsaturated fatty acids and cancer of the breast and colorectum. Emerging evidence for their roles as risk modifiers. So the hypothesis that a high-fat diet promotes the development of postmenopausal breast cancer is supported by international data, so showing a strong correlation between fat intake and breast cancer rates, and modest positive associations with high-fat diet in case control studies. Dietary fat intake was found to be unrelated to risk of breast cancer in cohort studies. In view of these conflicting findings, it has been difficult to make nutritional recommendations for the prevention of breast cancers. Studies in animal models and recent observation in humans, however, provided evidence that a high intake of polyunsaturated fatty acids stimulates several stages in the development of mammary and colon cancer, for the increase in oxidative DNA damage to effects on cell proliferation, free estrogen levels to hormonal catabolism. In contrast, fish oils derived from omega-3 instead of the omega-6 seems to prevent cancer by influencing the activity of enzymes and proteins related to intracellular signaling and ultimately cell proliferation. In this commentary, current evidence from experimental and human studies is summarized that implications of high intake of omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids in cancer of the breast, colon, and possibly prostate, and which indicates that the omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids and monounsaturated fatty acids such as oleic are protective, plausible mechanisms. So again, science, there is science out there talking about the at least associations between higher omega-6, and you even realize the colorectal cancer here that seems to be possibly caused by the omega-6, yet you always hear the red meat in colorectal cancer. So that's why policies and what you see on media is extremely cherry-picked, and that's why nutrition science is very deceptive and can pretty much justify any single kind of diet. Go to the next one here. Health implications of high dietary omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. Just omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids and omega-3 are precursors to potent lipid mediators, signaling molecules termed eicosanoids, and have important roles in regulation of inflammation. In general, the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids are pro-inflammatory, while the omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. Dietary changes over the past few decades in the intake of 6 compared to 3 show striking increases in the omega-6 to 3 ratios. Some here, example 15 to 1, sometimes much higher. So 15 times as much omega-6 as omega-3. And what occurs here is that there's so much omega-6, then it starts to even inhibit the available omega-3 through your diet, further reducing your omega-3 and worsening your omega-6, which are associated with greater metabolism of the omega-6 compared to omega-3, coinciding with an increase in this ratio. These PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, are increases in chronic inflammation disease, such as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease, obesity, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, Alzheimer's disease. By increasing the ratio of 3 to 6 PUFAs in the Western diet, reduction may be achieved in the incidence of these chronic inflammatory diseases. So, if you look at a lot of the vegans that might be quoting some of the studies, basically saying that fat leads to insulin resistance, fat causes all sorts of problems, it's because often they're not differentiating between the 6s, between the 3s. They're not splitting up the plant compared to the traditional saturated fats in animal fats. So, again, poor quality studies can come up to conclusions, and because they're not separating the plants from the animal fats, then the fats always look like they're causing issues, and this is, again, the poor science that confuses everybody. When you look at here, the linoleic acid that is embedded in our adipose tissue, because as monogastrics we can't really change omega-6 into anything else. We can just store it and absorb it, since they're the mediators. Since these are basically fats that are like almost hormonal and signal and create mediators for inflammation, anti-inflammation, going well and beyond with the amount of omega-6. Once the essential purpose of it is used, then it just gets stored in our body composition, and the whole structure of our body starts being more and more omega-6. So for example, LDL, all sorts of molecules start containing more and more omega-6, and it makes them prone, and basically your whole body, if there's that much omega-6, it causes an inflammatory adipose tissue. It causes many issues, and it stays quite long in our body. So look over 1955, over here, 1955 to 2005. Look at the percentage of linoleic acid, the omega-6 plant fats, within our adipose tissue. Now, again, why aren't we hearing this? All we're hearing now is the red meat, the processed red meat causing colorectal cancer. We're never hearing, and in fact, the doctor will tell you to consume these soybean oils, these plant vegetable oils. They'll tell you to consume margarine. And yet, why is this evidence being ignored? This is an actual new incorporation, guys, of a brand new food that happened in the early 20th century. All of a sudden, long and behold, we start having heart attack issues in the 50s, which I think initially was primarily due to inappropriate ingestion of these foreign fats, the elimination and reduction of the fats over the following 50 years, and not catching on in the early 20th century that cigarette smoke also was causing a large amount. So they didn't catch on to the vegetable oils or the smoking, and when heart attack rates started to increase, then after they just decided, hey, maybe it's the traditional foods, maybe it's the foods of antiquity, maybe it's the ruminant animals, maybe it's the fat that was so prized and cherished prior for millennia. Maybe it's that. Let's look at, do I have anything else here to show you in relation to that? Sorry, let's erase this one. So here's another one, just an increase in adipose tissue, linoleic acid in the US adults. Hey, guys, if you notice that it sounds windy, sorry, I hope that it's not affecting too much the sound quality. It's because I'm outside doing this. Again, so here we can see the increase in adipose tissue of linoleic acid in adults in the last half century, and we definitely see a large increase. This is basically the study where I just got the diagram. Let's see here. If we look over here, ours on the bottom here, our results indicate that adipose tissue of linoleic acid has increased by over 136% over the last half century, and that this increase is highly correlated with an increase in dietary linoleic intake, seed oils, margarine, Crisco, over the same time period. Anything else? Okay, not only are we talking about these seed oils making us burn and get red like lobsters, we see that the omega-6 is going after every organ. It's causing the heart disease, it's causing the colorectal cancer, it's causing the heart disease. Look, it's a molecule that inflames your whole body and sends an extreme amount of oxidative stress, and this disrupts DNA. And that's why once the ketogenic diet or the carnivore diet is is incorporated, then a lot of the chronic diseases just naturally start reversing itself. This is, again, anecdotal evidence, but this is kind of what we're doing is we're rediscovering anecdotal evidence over a large group and tribe and community of people sharing experiences and starting to see the commonalities within their personal experiences to start guiding the way that they eat. And over time, this is how humans were able to become so fine-tuned in their traditional cultural non-modernized diets. It was all trial and error, and it was a close-knit community with communication and personal experience that developed this ancestral wisdom, which science has caused us to totally negate, and this is why we find ourselves in this situation. This omega-6 vegetable oils as a driver for coronary heart disease is basically that LDL that contains high amounts of omega-6 oxidize, and these LDLs are really not resistant to oxidation when they contain omega-3, and they do have resistance to oxidation. The LDL have to become oxidized. The LDL themselves are not pathological. They're required. They have a purpose. It's that the LDL, as well as the membranes of your wall, as well as your whole body, starts to have a derangement, starts to not function properly. And then LDL becomes part of the problem, but it's definitely not the cause. Okay, we looked at this one here. I think that we've gone through most of them. My next video, I think that we're going to talk also about this new study that came out that was published August 2020. It's from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. It's titled Saturated Fat and Health, and it's a reassessment and proposal for food-based recommendations. So as we know, the food guide has just recently been updated where saturated fat is again demonized, where cholesterol, again dietary cholesterol, is encouraged to be eliminated. Yet you have this science. Now let's look at this study, okay? The U.S. dietary guidelines recommend a restriction for the saturated fat intake to less than 10% of the calories to reduce coronary vascular disease. This is a claim. So different saturated fatty acids have different biological effects, which are further modified by food matrix and carbohydrate content of the diet. So, understand that if you're consuming a high carbohydrate diet, that yes, if you're adding these kinds of fats in that situation, then you have a high carb, and then you're adding what is beyond essential for you, and now you kind of have two fuel sources, and that fat will tend to be stored also, as well as the carbohydrates that are beyond the ATP requirement, the energy and metabolic requirements of that time. It's a completely different story when this non-essential carbohydrate is eliminated and we're going after the proper animal foods. We're just automatically going to fix our omega-6 to 3 ratio, as well as starting to eat what our body truly is composed of, fats and proteins, and we're going to allow the non-essential macronutrients at least to drop to way below the 60% that is recommended, because we can produce glucose. I just want to read the abstract, and I think I'm going to do a video completely just on this study. So the recommendation for limit, let's try that again. The recommendation to limit dietary saturated fatty acids intake has persisted despite mounting evidence to the contrary. So we see a dietary mythology here that seems to have occurred over 2 generations, or the last century, or since the 20th century. Most recent meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials and observational studies found no beneficial effect of reducing saturated fatty acid intake on cardiovascular disease and total mortality, and instead actually found a protective effect against strokes. So what are we saying here? We're saying that despite the mounting evidence that saturated fat is good for you, most recent meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, which is literally the gold standard, as well as the observational studies, when we do a meta-analysis, what we're doing is we're looking at the totality of science that has been done on this particular topic. It is peer-reviewed, it is scrutinized, they look for the weaknesses of the studies, they might exclude certain studies because they're deeply flawed, and in this one they look not only at these observational studies that can only prove association, they're literally looking at randomized control trials that helps these kind of studies go more towards what is root cause of things. Now, what they're saying is when you look at the whole thing over the last 20th century till now, weeding out the crap science within there and looking at the underlying image or message that's being given, they see that to the contrary, even though the American Heart Association and even though all dietetics and nutritional organizations as well as globally are obsessed with this false notion that saturated fat, the science has been signed, sealed, and delivered, has been closed, it's written in stone, when in reality, no, it's not written in stone. And in fact, everything's pointing away towards the benefit of saturated fatty acids. As you can see here, we just mentioned that not only does it not lead to cardiovascular disease or total mortality, meaning overall dying of something, it has a profound protective effect against stroke. And this is what we see, that low cholesterols and a low saturated fatty intake does lead to dementia, to neurological dysfunctions, to depression, as well as actual stroke. People with low cholesterol tend to stroke out more. Although saturated fatty acids increase low-density lipoproteins, the LDL cholesterol, in most individuals this is not due to increasing levels of the small, dense LDL particles, but rather a larger subgroup of the LDL particles, which are much less strongly related to cardiovascular risk. Not to mention, if you are... So what they're saying is the only reason that saturated fat initially was demonized was because it increased LDL. However, LDL is not the culprit, and if you have a human-appropriate diet, the LDL will not get oxidized. Not to mention that saturated fatty acids in some individuals will increase LDL, which is currently demonized, which is also not based on sound science, but more nutritional mythology. However, when it does increase, most doctors do the basic LDL, HDL, total cholesterol, and triglycerides. If they see an LDL that is quite elevated, they will put you on a statin to lower that, when they should do their job and go one step further if they do believe in statins and say, okay, well, your LDL has increased, but is it the dangerous, very low density lipoprotein, the particle size that is problematic? And this is rarely the case. So it's also apparent that the health effects of foods cannot be predicted by their content in any nutritional group without considering the overall macronutrient distribution. Therefore, whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, that means red meat included, steak, beef, the dark chocolate, or even dark chocolate, really, 80-90% cocoa, are saturated fatty acid rich foods with a complex matrix that are not associated with increased risk in cardiovascular disease. So the totality of available evidence does not support further limiting the intake of such foods. It's very frustrating because you still see a lot of media attention on demonizing animal foods, on trying to disprove the ketogenic diet, of trying to support the low-fat, high-carb diet. Yet even the latest studies, you will not see or hear one darn thing. And this, unfortunately, for some reason, never even gets to the cardiologist that at least I have spoken with. It's very unfortunate. All right, thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for watching my channel, and see you around.